Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm Kara Carmack, the Assistant Director of Exhibitions and Public Programs here at the New York Studio School, and I'm honored to welcome you to our Fall 2024 Evening Lecture Series. We're nearing the end of the season's lectures, with just one more taking place virtually after Thanksgiving. But tonight we're thrilled to welcome curator Stephan Wolohojian this evening, who will be speaking about his blockbuster exhibition, Siena, The Rise of Painting, 1300 to 1350, currently on view at the Met through January 26. A reminder to those in person on 8th Street to please silence all cell phones during tonight's event. We'll reserve time at the end for a Q&A. For those in the room, please raise your hand and I'll bring a microphone to you so our online audience can hear your question. For our Zoom audience, you can submit your questions through the chat or by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. The New York Studio School is grateful to the following funders for their support of the 2024-25 Evening Lecture Series: the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York State Council on the Arts, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the Robert Lehman Foundation, and many generous individual contributors. This evening's lecture in particular is generously supported by the Samuel H. Kress Foundation. With their grant, they've also helped us digitize historic lectures from our archives related to European art before 1900. I encourage you to visit our YouTube channel to find these recordings and many more. Following the lecture, please join us downstairs in the Clayroom for light refreshments and to continue the conversation. Now I'm delighted to introduce our guest this evening. John Pope-Hennessy, Curator in charge of European paintings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art here in New York, Stephan Wolohojian received his PhD from Harvard University, where he was also head of the Division of European and American Art at the Harvard Art Museums. He's held academic and museum positions and has curated many exhibitions and coordinated major reinstallations of permanent collections. Among his projects at the Met was the exhibition Manet, Degas, and overseeing the highly acclaimed reinstallation of the pre-1800 collection of European paintings in the museum's renovated skylit galleries. As I mentioned before, this talk is held in conjunction with the Met's exhibition Siena, The Rise of Painting, 1300 to 1350, on view through January 26, 2025. Now please join me in offering a very warm welcome to Stephan.
Thank you, Kara, and good evening. It's a great pleasure to be with you this evening and to explore questions about painting and the very practice of that art. And we take this for granted so much. We're so familiar with this notion of painting. But the notion we imagine obviously comes with agency. It comes with a mark made by a person trying to express a certain idea. And that's not exactly been the case always in the Western tradition. Certainly, as we'll look at together, there are important traditions that come together at this moment, we argue and explore in this exhibition around 1300. And so today I wanted to map not necessarily a tour of this exhibition, which I hope you have an opportunity to see, because there are truly epic moments in it that are singular in the reconstruction of certain works that have been dispersed for centuries and never assessed as an entirety. But to look at the exhibition as a framework, to think about certain questions, think about things that are incredibly central to the way we, as either historians or art practitioners, think about when we think about painting as an art. One of the things that underscores my own commitment to trying to convey this to our audiences, comes across, I hope, in this first image I'm sharing. Anyone who's come to the exhibition and come to its threshold sees that when you look into its portal, you see a blank wall, no text, no celebration of the title, no map to tell you where you are in Italy or anything, but a singular painting, a small painting. A painting, when you look at it on its own in reproduction, really disorients in terms of scale, in terms of size, its volumes difficult to assess. Its threshold at the bottom is a marble ledge. And when you think of marble, mimetically, you think of something at this scale, right? Marble is not something that's worked in miniature. Marble is something you use for large entablatures, for architectural things of tremendous dimension. Yet this picture is literally the size of a piece of letterhead paper. It's something you hold. It's something you behold. It's something that you can contemplate very much off the wall and experience in a variety of multivalent ways. And this was a bold decision. It wasn't an obvious decision to install it the way we did. But what I tried to do was to put it in concert with a certain constellation of objects. There are 4 objects in that space. I'm going to look at 2 of them more closely with you to try to invite people to put the work of art in dialogue with other works of art, to generate their own ideas, to have certain experiences, whether it's a 3-dimensional or a 2-dimensional work, inform the experience of looking, and to try to assess the special nature of this material. So if we look back at the wonderful small work by Duccio from around 1300, certain aspects of it come immediately to the fore. One, anyone even unfamiliar with the life of such objects is struck by the fact that its lower ledge has those singed marks, remnants of candlelight that flickered in front of it and made its gold ground resonate with flickering surfaces and allowed that saturated profile of the Virgin and Child before it to create quite a volumetric profile. And then within its engaged frame, a very extraordinary dialogue of tactility, certainly that ledge we look below, but also around its borders, you see a tooled and worked decoration, a decorative band that we'll come back to in a minute and explore the meaning of more further. The other work that we have in dialogue with this is this sculpture, tiny as well, something that could be held in a hand, something that could be transported with a traveler. And one of the extraordinarily important things that we ask people to consider in the context of this exhibition is Siena's place in the geography of Europe and in Italy. It has no port, it's not on a river, it's not on a traditional axis for international exchange. It is, however, a central point on a very important route that we'll be looking at later, and that extended from the north of Europe to the south, to Rome after. And these objects, such as this ivory here, were objects that would have been transported with the people traveling on that route and coming through the city walls on their way south or on their way north. The qualities in that ivory, the volume of the drapery, the graceful folds, the weight even of that small figure is something that Duccio responds to in his modeling of this, again, very small image of the Virgin Mary. But the bigger challenge of working on an image of the Madonna and Child around 1300 is the long legacy, the long tradition of the image of the Virgin Mary. I should remind you that we could pretty much, in any lineup with no religious backing, identify the Virgin and her son Jesus. You know what she looks like, but why? It's a miraculously made image. It reflects an exchange, a moment where the evangelist St. Luke, according to tradition, writing in his study, as he wants to do, is interrupted by a vision of the Virgin and her son, who says, Luke, put down your piece of paper, take your pen, and record my image. This became the true image of the Virgin. It became the authoritative image. It became an image that for a millennium in Byzantium was repeated, rehearsed, remade. Its authority was built on its repetition. Long history about that, even in the 20th century with Walter Benjamin and the reproduction of an image. Think of all the Marilyns that Warhol has. The reproduction makes that image even more famous. It doesn't diminish it. There's very little room for you if you're a painter when you're just rehearsing Luke's exercise, right? I mean, any change in that, making her a blonde, making her I don't know what, would be an issue. The authority of that image would be very much reduced. And next to the Stockley Madonna, that little Duccio in the exhibition, we've put the earliest recorded Byzantine icon that we have from Siena, something that we think was there by the 1260s, so just a few decades before Duccio made that painting. And what's so wonderful about its first record is that it's recorded as that painting made by St. Luke. So even in the 15th century in Siena, they knew who made that painting. They knew what that painting was about. And so it's very interesting to go back to Duccio and to think about that point we looked at the corner here, where the gold ground stops against this shelf, we can almost read it as, that invites us to think about that more as an image of an image than it is of the image generated by this sort of embodied act of repeating St. Luke. Duccio is in fact painting a painting of a painting. He's actually making an image of a painting. And with that, he can actually step back and be an artist and assess his practice. And it's a truly extraordinary thing. I show you a well-known Byzantine icon in the British Museum. It just allows you to even imagine this in the context of Byzantine practice here. The image on a shelf there with people praying around it. Just to show you what Duccio is imagining here by divorcing himself from that ventriloquized act, let's call it, of making Luke's image yet again. This is now Duccio painting this image. It's always helpful and a wonderful thing on a November evening in New York to have a nice bird's eye view of Siena. Siena, extraordinary city, on top of a hill, dominated by two major structures working in tandem. Here, I'm sorry, this is the pointer. Here at the center, the town hall, the Palazzo Pubblico, the seat of secular government, and at a point slightly higher, the cathedral. It's Duomo, but very much in concert with the civic elected government of 9 council members. This was an important thing to consider. Siena was in an incredible battle in the last decades of the 13th century against Florence, the famous Battle of Montaperti, many of you may have heard of. And one could feel in the perch of that city looking down at the bloodshed below, the smoke, the death of its citizens against the nearly victorious Florentines. And apparently, when it looked like Siena was going to fall to its neighboring Florence, one of Siena's citizens looked up to the heavens and said that if the Virgin Mary led Siena to victory against the Florentines, the city would be dedicated to her. And so you have to imagine her then as both secular head of the city and obviously religious object for devotion as well. This famous road that I was telling you about, the Via Francigena, the French road, runs from the north of Europe down to Rome, an important site, obviously, for many reasons, and to the south of that, to Naples. It was obviously an important artery in the 13th century. Consider it sort of like the I-95 that we're on today. You couldn't go from Massachusetts or from Maine to Florida without trying to figure out whether you could avoid the George Washington Bridge or not. Here you actually had to go through Siena. In fact, there was no periphery road. You went in one gate and out the other. It's an important thing to consider, especially around 1300, when Boniface VIII establishes the first Jubilee, the first year. We're about to go into a major Jubilee in 2025, where a full plenary indulgence was offered to all Christians who made the pilgrimage to Rome. Imagine that. Imagine all the people who came and passed through the city's gates on their way to Rome, or back from Rome up north. But it also was a route that transported merchants, bankers, prelates, emperors, kings. It was a major thoroughfare that saw all sorts of commerce and all sorts of things passing through its city, cultural exchange at its most subtle and most complex. The objects in the exhibition speak to that. On the one hand, on the slide on the right, we have the earliest recorded French ivory in Italy, recorded in an inventory already in 1370 in Assisi, again, witness to the fact that these objects were with travelers and with people down from the north. It's an extraordinary work, not just because it's one that we can actually fix in Italy, but it truly is one of the masterpieces of French Gothic ivory carving by a major Parisian carver. And yet on the other side, we see a work made in basse-taille or translucent enamel, a technique that the Sienese invented in the end of the 13th and early 14th century, and that was immediately copied and repeated in enameling centers throughout Europe. Its technical term is basse-taille enamel, a French word, and it always makes me laugh that the French who copied the technique actually named it. It should be called something Italian, but it became French just because they are obviously the enameling geniuses and the center we associate with enamel making. We mentioned that this important route brought people into the city, and when this exchange happened, these important visitors, or even less important ones, often ordered works as they passed through the city gates by its major painters. These two works belong to one of the great cardinal bishops of the time, the Bishop of Ostia, a man named Niccolo da Prato. And we don't need to go too deeply into them here, except they are extraordinary works that allow us to think very much about the material nature, the object nature of these paintings made on wood, gilt with sheets of gold, tooled, punched, stippled, painted with wings that open and close, really theaters of visual experience as they were animated by those before them. What's extraordinary to think about these works is they're first recorded in a will that their owner, Niccolò de Prato, makes, that's executed in the French city of Avignon. And so imagine these works so far from where they were made, north of the Alps, and we'll return to Avignon in a bit. What I'd like to do is to return to this interesting relationship of the city to the work of art, because it actually speaks to a kind of special place of painting more fully, one that is actually rather wonderful to think about through a contemporary lens. This was the most ambitious altarpiece commissioned anywhere around 1300. It was commissioned in 1308, but by the city government for the Cathedral of Siena. So a secular commission for a religious setting. And Duccio worked on it from 1308 to 1311. And we have wonderful documents that allow us to imagine it being paraded from his studio through the streets of Siena to great fanfare, celebration, drums, banners, a full parade until it made its way to the cathedral. And she then, the enthroned Virgin Mary, spiritual and secular leader of the city, was installed on its high altar. It was a myth or a legend or a story that very much resonated in the 19th century, one that you can see here channeled through Vasari, where the English painter Frederick Leighton, in this huge, look at the dimension, it's 5 meters, so I don't know what that makes in feet, almost 20 feet distance. It's the largest painting in the National Gallery in London, so large that Buckingham Palace doesn't even hang it. They leave it on loan there. And it's fascinating because, as you can see from the title, it shows what Frederick Leighton thought was a narrative from the Florentine Cimabue's life and not from the Sienese painter Duccio's life. And that confusion is really fascinating to look at, because if you look at the painting that supposedly Cimabue with his young assistant Giotto and all of these Florentine people are carrying through, it's not actually a painting by Cimabue, but actually a painting by Duccio that was in a major church in Florence. And so great was that hold through history, through the return to certain very clear and demarcated narratives that put the origin story of Italian painting into Florence, that even when the document was first discovered that proved that the painting that Frederick Leighton saw in Florence and thought was by Cimabue was not by Cimabue, but by Duccio, it took about 3.5 decades for people to read the document and say, okay, it's not that story. But what it is wonderful to think about is the modernity of that object. Imagine painting being seen as science, being seen as something so essential and so worthy of celebration that it was paraded through the streets of a town, that there was a civic celebration to celebrate the completion of an artistic work of such ambition that it actually rivaled, it brought together art, painting, brought together every craft, whether it was carpentry, whether it was a simulation of metalwork, whether it was a theology. The Maestà was a full project, very much the way, as some people have said, Louis Blériot's monoplane was celebrated after Blériot had crossed the Channel in 1909. For the first time, you see the propeller of that plane being paraded in front of the Place de l'Opéra in Paris. And the very modernity of the Maestà, with its iconic sort of bullseye central image, its static core of the enthroned Madonna and Child, with those narrative bands of scenes, both at the bottom of the top, resonate even in mid-century paintings, such as this by Jasper Johns, his target of 55. Very interesting the way the painting integrates the tactile, the three-dimensional with that central image, and obviously Alechinsky's Astre and Désastre, where in fact he, against the silver ground below, makes a kind of sequence of lunar and solar eclipse. The narratives of the Maestà are key. The predella is the first extant predella of early Italian art, or of Italian painting period. Those of us who teach Italian painting try to get that one vocabulary word down in our students' mind, the extraordinary linear sequence of images, and to have the opportunity to see narrative elements from Duccio's Maestà is truly remarkable. The exhibition brings together for the first time every extant narrative panel from the reverse predella. And what's truly quite extraordinary to see is these panels at what I call, for lack of a better word, but very scientific and technically, at altar height. To be able to experience them at eye level, to be able to experience them as a spatial sequence, because often, especially if you go to Siena, where the remaining sequences are, they're exhibited quite low. And here one can actually read through the narrative sequence following Duccio's various narrative strategies and approaches to narration and to temporal sequence in its painting. The exhibition also leaves two major voids at either side of the sequence that allow visitors to feel the presence of the large buttresses that secured this work. This work, almost 15 by 16 feet in dimension, 500 square feet of painted surface, front and back. Truly extraordinary thing. In one of the labels, I actually share an order of candles, both for the front and the back, just to remind people of the vastness of the expense and even of the volume. I think the order for the front of the Maestà is something like 180 candles, and the order I cite just to illuminate this extraordinary object, this painted object, this object painting, this work of such huge dimension that even though you feel you can understand it as an object that could be held, like a small reliquary or a small devotional image, like you see with these two panels that we've placed before it that are drawn from the Lehman collection at the Metropolitan Museum. This work translates that on a monumental scale. I always wonder what would have happened if the ambition of Duccio's Maestà hadn't gotten in the way. A picture plane, again, as I said, 15 feet or so in dimension, uninterrupted spatially. So an open plane where figure, space, the constructed throne, all work in tandem with each other. It took another century and a half for artists to unify the space around the Virgin and Child, the pictorial space in a planar sequence, because clearly that project was just far too ambitious for the early Italian workshop to be able to sustain. In fact, just as there was really nothing that came before Duccio's Maestà, nothing really comes after it of that same ambition. In fact, the practical solution to its many temptations was to create what we know so well as the polyptych, a painted altarpiece made of several different panels that could all be painted separately, and then when completed, it could be assembled on the altar. Think of how practical that solution was, and think about how it helped artists in a workshop context work on certain areas. You could have red paint on your palette and needing to be applied before it dried, and just paint it, say, on the book here, while at the same time someone with green could work on that. And that wasn't possible on the unified plane of the Maestà, where everyone's elbows would be vying for space in order to do what they needed to do on the neighboring area that needed to be painted. It's an extraordinary thing to see this altarpiece in the exhibition. It's the work of Pietro Lorenzetti, one of the main followers of, or the artists of the generation after Duccio in Siena, and it's his earliest documented work, a work for which we have the contract of 1320. And it's a wonderful contract to parse out, because one of the wonderful things about it is that the contract asks for the artist's design as well as his execution, but it stipulates that the people who commission it will actually supply the carpentry and the panel itself. So a division here of expertise. And one of the most wonderful things about the expertise here is that the carpenter probably had never seen or imagined a polyptych before, and he made each element on large planks of wood that are almost 10 feet in height and really massive in scale. So it's an incredible thing to see in the context of the exhibition, and especially when exhibited as we have next to this extraordinary ensemble from the same decade, from the 1320s, by one of the other artists we concentrate on, Simone Martini, an artist who thoroughly absorbed everything that was coming down from the north, from the Gothic, on the Via Francigena, working very, very closely with Angevin patrons in Naples, who is commissioned in the 1320s by the city again. So we'd see these pictures on their surface as being religious, but this series of paintings was first commissioned to be used for purposes unclear to any of us. All we know is that they wanted Simone Martini to paint panels to be kept in a civic building. For what purpose, we don't know, but they were clearly meant to be seen in the round, because the panel on the far right, this one here of St. Luke that's in the Getty Museum, which still retains its original engaged frame and has its back pristine the way it was made, is actually painted, the back is actually painted with a porphyry surface, so a stone surface, a surface that invites us to consider both its materiality and its image on the front, but also reminds us that these paintings were meant to be seen front and back, and that they were probably mobile images and only set into a altarpiece structure in the 15th century, where we see them recorded in the town hall, in a chapel in it, with a predella that was later painted in the 15th century underneath. I want to return to this question of object painting, because it really is something that's central to my thinking about these works, and I think has been resonating with the people that Kara talked about who are flocking to the exhibition. The very inability ever to assess whether you really just want to hold these things or whether you just want to look at them. It's an odd thing. You rarely get that prohibition of don't touch painting when you're looking at it today, a canvas on a flat wall. These are really things that have weight, that have a certain surface, and that play against that dialogue in their making. This work, also of absolutely tiny dimension. I'm sorry I didn't put the dimensions in inches. This too is like the size of the small Duccio that I start with. And like the Duccio, it absorbs certain aspects of a larger ensemble. Here, Simone Martini has, in a very low relief, sort of built a kind of predella underneath this, this image made certainly for a Dominican nun who is praying at the far right. But one of the opportunities of the exhibition is to see this work front and back, which is a privilege we often don't get to see when you see it in Boston at the Gardner Museum, because the Gardner Museum, if you've ever been there, was installed by the collector who brought the works together, Isabella Stewart Gardner, and she arranged the ensemble, and in her will said that nothing could be moved and nothing could be changed. And so she had this work mounted against a very beautiful little seated area by a window, but you can't see the back of it. And when you see the back of it, you see a flat plane that 700 years ago, when it was pristine, was tooled, worked, dimensional, and here it's actually a silver leaf that has a glaze over it to look like gold. But you would have been tricked, or you would have been not wrong to imagine that what you were looking at was the back of a work of a goldsmith, or the back of an enamel, or the back of something that was not, in fact, just wood and pigment brought together. And that wouldn't have been necessarily a deceit. It would have been actually imbricated into the experience of beholding these works themselves. The fact that their materiality was so key to their experience is something quite extraordinary to consider. Siena dominated the production of small images for personal devotion. We used to call these works for private devotion years back, but there's something odd about that use of private, because it assumes a kind of insular experience, a kind of closed, locked-down view. These were often seen in public spaces, but the experience was a singular one, a personal one. Their scale responded to a very intimate look at them. And one of the wonderful opportunities of the exhibition is to look at artistic engagement with the subject matter at hand. And no place better is this possible than in looking at two works, two crucifixions from the same decade by the brothers Ambrogio Lorenzetti in this extraordinary small painting on the left, and his brother Pietro Lorenzetti in a crucifixion at the Met. Very much, as I said, the same subject matter, but handled in such personal and distinct ways. You see how every element in Ambrogio's painting, whether it's the trembling depiction of the rock at the base of the scene, the energetic and tense group of Roman centurions and saints above, the way the Magdalene just guides us to the central figure of Christ, and then back down to this virgin who has lost her corporeality in the death of her son. She's lost her being. She who is the vessel of his incarnation is now just a handkerchief. She's lost her bodily weight. So different from the approach, the more plastic, the more formal, the more sculptural approach of his brother Pietro to the same subject. But the question of their collaboration is also raised in the exhibition. It's the first opportunity to contemplate two panels, one in Berlin and with the one that we just saw that's up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They're panels of identical dimension. Their tooling and their making is identical. You can see here the punch work on the Berlin painting. You can't quite see it in the reproduction here, is identical to the one in Cambridge, but they're made by two separate artists, Pietro and his brother Ambrogio. And the question arises, did patrons at this time recognize the difference in these two artists' style? Did they want the juxtaposition of the two artists' work? Was this a kind of mini exhibition of the Lorenzetti brothers? Every time you opened it up, you could contemplate the formal and pictorial qualities of one artist against that of the other. Or is it just happenstance that the brothers used the same carpenters and borrowed the same tools and shared an artistic practice, which are questions that need to be answered and understood. I sort of love the idea of a kind of sophisticated assessment of two works by two different artists, but part of the same ensemble, that kind of collaboration that in more modern times is quite familiar. One of the most extraordinary works in the exhibition is this drawing, this underdrawing, a preparatory layer to a fresco by Ambrogio Lorenzetti that reveals truly the psychological and pictorial intelligence of this painter. Frescoes, as you know, are built are made from plaster that is applied to a built surface, a monumental surface. And the fine plaster that we often find when we look at frescoed murals is not the surface that binds it to the wall behind it. There's an intermediary surface of much rougher plaster that often has hay or horsehair bits entangled in it so that it can really grip onto the wall and also provide a surface for the finer plaster of the finished fresco to adhere to. And it also provided an opportunity for artists to translate a work on a smaller scale to the large monumental scale that they would eventually need to make for these monumental paintings. And these works were covered over. We call them cenopiae, because they're made out of a chalk, a stone, that we call cenope. And although Ambrogio Lorenzetti would never imagine that we in New York City at the Metropolitan Museum in 2024 would be looking literally at the underwear of that fresco that he made on top of this, they're extraordinary works to contemplate and to study because they allow us an insight into the pictorial imagination of the artists who made the frescoes on top. These works were covered, as I said, by the formal fresco surface that went over them. And when you look at Ambrogio's drawing of the Virgin Annunciate, Ambrogio is not showing us an image of a woman accepting this news with grace and calm and some kind of measure. He shows the psychological anguish, the torment, the emotional tumult of a young woman whose chamber has been entered by the angel Gabriel, who announces to her that she's going to bear a son. And Ambrogio, when he's imagining this story, grounds her on a marble column. You see here the base and the marble column. And he tries to stabilize, or he shows us a young woman stabilizing herself by hugging that column and slowly gliding down to it as her body becomes a vessel made in the most free and confident gesture with this chalk with which he worked. It's an extraordinary insight into the penetrating exploration of subject matter. And alas, such works were not seen by the public because the work that goes over it, and I'm sorry I don't have the image to share with you tonight. We include a photo in the exhibition, has a much more measured and much more steady image of the Virgin, very much like the more rational encounter that Ambrogio Lorenzetti stages in this important painting, which is signed and dated, and which, if we follow the 20th century art historian Erwin Panofsky, is the first fully realized project of single-point perspective that comes down to us in Western painting. And of course, perspective is something we could talk about all evening. It's not necessarily just a mathematical overlay that complicates things for artists or makes them feel, smart because they can deal with math. It's actually a really extraordinary stabilization of the picture field, because the point, obviously, that's anchored by the orthogonals that form the ground plane on which the composition is built. So these orthogonals all come to a point around here, stabilize themselves from in the same distance in one point outside of the picture plane. So what happens in this process is that the painting is understood through the beholder that's situated in one point, the singular experience of looking by the person outside of the painting. That, by the way, is us. We are the beholders. We are the makers of all the images that we see. This is, in fact, the exchange of modern painting, the experience of looking and seeing as the beholder, not the commissioner and the patron or the artist in the making, but the beholder situated and stabilized in front of the picture. I want to just return for the few moments I have left to Simone Martini, an artist we haven't looked at adequately enough yet. I mentioned this grand route that transversed from north to south the western part of Europe, the Via Fraigigena. It becomes a very important part of the Sienese story after the Pope's move to Avignon in the first quarter of the 14th century. If you remember, the last decades of the 13th century saw a tremendous power struggle between an ever-increasingly powerful French monarch who had links to the south of Rome with Naples. The king of Naples was actually a brother of the French monarch. And so there was always this sense on the part of the French monarchy of why was I, one of the most powerful figure in Europe, having to go to Rome? Rome should come to me. And Boniface VIII, very strong pope, was incredibly strategic in many ways. He's the one who founds the first Jubilee in 1300, sort of making it essential for people to recognize the primacy of Rome, but Boniface VIII dies in 1308, and the papacy moves to Avignon. If you've been to Avignon, you've seen the great papal palace there. It stays there for about 100 years in what we call the Babylonian captivity, and it's an extraordinary moment, not only in papal history to explore, but it's an interesting thing to imagine as a very sophisticated circle of patrons. Rome still exists. St. Peter's is still there, all the administrative functions of Rome, but the College of Cardinals, if anyone's seen Conclave, all that stuff moved to Avignon with the Pope, and a very sophisticated circle of people there. And what's fascinating is in the 1330s, Simone Martini, who has hands down the most successful and strong workshop in Siena, closes it down entirely and moves with his wife and his daughter to France, to Avignon, and resettles there. It's one of the interesting moments in the story because it shifts geographies. Is Simone still a Sienese painter when he's there? What does it mean to be what? Is he now starting a whole new tradition of French painting by moving there? It's a very interesting thing, but it also allows us to look back at his practice leading up to that and to recognize his Gothic sensibilities. They're very different from Ambrogio, very different from Pietro. They show very different strategies, back to that idea that really allows us to think about how artists are experiencing their practice. Who am I? What am I showing and why? What do I respond to in making the very same images, whether they're Madonna and Child or crucifixion images? And one of the extraordinary things in France is that Simone Martini is working for these cardinals and important members of the Curia. Here we see this extraordinary group of 4 panels, which are first recorded in the Chartreuse de Champmol outside of Dijon, the burial site of the Burgundian kings. They belonged to the Dukes of Valois in the 15th century. It's certainly in the Chartreuse de Champmol that the Limburg brothers see them and draw from them for their imagery and manuscript illumination. And they stayed in Champmol until the French Revolution. Alas, Champmol was one of the first targets of the revolution because of the royal nature of its foundation. And since then, the 4 panels have been dispersed. The one on the far left at the Louvre, the one on the far right in Berlin, and the 2 in the middle in Antwerp, and they have never been seen together. So in over 220 years or so, together for the first time uptown at the Met. It's wonderful to think about Simone as an artist practitioner in Avignon. Among the extraordinary things to consider is his friendship with the humanist Petrarch. Petrarch owned a celebrated volume of works by Virgil given to him by his father, and in the 1330s, he actually asks his friend Simone Martini to illuminate a frontispiece for that private volume. One of the most extraordinary revivals of antiquity with these white diaphanous curtains and cloth, the figures of the poet and the inspired writer with his quill. One of the most extraordinary couplets of the 14th century is that of Petrarch, where he meditates that in the same way that Mantua made Virgil and his poetic voice, Siena made Simone and his artistic talent. And so to align poetry, painting, place, and artist is an extraordinary thing that the study of Virgil, of Petrarch's Virgil, and a meditation on the friendship that these two great artists, writer, humanist, and painter, and I'm going to go so far as to say humanist, bring together. And in fact, the last work in the exhibition and the last work I want to look at today brings all these ideas together. Simone Martini in Avignon paints this painting. It's signed and dated at the bottom in a very modern way. Oops. Simone Martini with the Anno Domini of 1342. It's in a rectangular frame, very modern in the picture field. And when you're at the museum, you see that it's a bit larger than most of the small images for private devotion, but certainly smaller than the scale of the monumental altarpieces. It's independent in every way. It has no signs of hinging on either side, making us think even more that it's independent as a singular image. And within the framework of that image, Simone explores the full potential of artistic practice. You see on the label we give it that it's called Christ in the Temple, but you can't see a temple here. There is no temple. It's not illustration in that way. What the story of Christ in the temple is the last major moment in Christ's infancy in the Bible. The young man, adolescent at this point, leaves home, goes to the temple, and starts arguing with the big guys. He's there with the boys, with theological discourse and everything else that the adults are talking about. And at home, his mother is worried stiff. And Simone explores that moment where you see Joseph, on the one hand, firmly aligned at his feet with this young boy, but breaking away at the hip, pointing over to this worried mother, saying, "Look what you've done to your mother. You've worried her stiff." And Christ responding, "Really? Come on, Mom. I was out at the corner with the guys. You know, I'm no longer a boy. I'm no longer your child." It's an extraordinary twist of the potential of the imaginary, the visual, to extend beyond the written. It makes us remember the very important grid that was established in the Middle Ages, where images were seen as important for those who could not read. They made written stories accessible. They brought them to a larger audience through the visual. But what Simone is showing us here is that painting, art itself, is not illustration. It's actually expression. It shows what words can't even express. There is no vocabulary, either at Simone's time, even Petrarch couldn't harness it, or in our own, to explain the subtleties of this emotion. I mean, this is Freud so much avant la lettre. This is a family story of such emotional complexity, and Simone expresses that. This is art fully at work. And nothing is more extraordinary than to go to the back of this painting, something that has not been seen by a general audience. In fact, this painting has been in Liverpool, England, for the last 200 years, in fact, more than 2 centuries. And it's in a beautiful sort of velvet shadow box that was made in the Victorian period to house it. And when I asked our colleagues in Liverpool if I could show it outside of that, they said, "Well, why?" And I said, "Well, you should see the back. It's quite extraordinary." They had never even seen it. But what's amazing about seeing this painting from both sides is when you look at Simone on the surface, Simone, who paints with a brush that seems like it only has 1 or 2 hairs in it, on the back waters down his pigment, grabs an incredibly fully loaded brush and paints stone. And he paints stone, not stone that you or I have ever seen, not stone that can be found in nature. Simone invents nature. He rivals that of the great maker himself, making something no longer that relates to something. This is no longer fake porphyry. This is no longer fake metal. This is no longer fake. This is artistic creation on the highest order. This is the birth, I would argue, of modern painting. Just as a coda, Simone Martini dies 2 years after this in 1344. His wife, his daughter, go back to Siena. In the last years of the 1340s, Siena is overtaken by a pandemic plague that wipes out over 2/3 of its population. 1347, Ambrogio Lorenzetti writes a will and shortly thereafter dies. His brother Pietro Lorenzetti certainly dead in the plague. Most of the people who commissioned these works dead. Most of the people who beheld them also no longer with us. And so in 1350, the story of a half a century of incredible artistic exploration comes to a close. Thank you. I think we're open for discussion here. Right?
Terrific. Yeah. Yes. So we have, we'll open up the floor for Q&A. For those of you in the room, please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you. And those of you online, feel free to type in your questions into the Q&A or the chat. Here's our first question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. I was fortunate enough to see the exhibit last week, and I wonder if you could remark about how the colors were done by the artists, because they're extraordinary and they have not faded, they haven't darkened, and has there been any restoration? It's just incredible to see the color.
Thank you for that question. It's an important one that invites us to think about these works as material objects. All of them are on panel, on wood very different from canvas in that it has a resilient, hard surface that when prepared, gessoed, can be gilt, can be tooled, can be punched, can be treated very much like a metal object, even made with the same tools. And these artists worked in tempera paint, so with ground up pigment applied with an egg-based medium, very different from oil paint, which is quite resilient. You have to build it from the darker shades up to the lighter shades. But what's wonderful about them, and interesting to consider, Kara and I were talking about this a bit at the beginning, is unlike oil paint, the pigment isn't saturated, doesn't float in the medium of oil, so it doesn't change the way oil paint does as the resins and varnish yellow and whatnot. And in fact, the Virgin Mary wears blue. One of the ways we can identify her. Blue is a nice color. I wear a lot of it, but she never had the opportunity to wear a pink dress or a red dress or a green dress. Blue is made from lapis lazuli. It came from Afghanistan. They knew about its origins in the East. It actually added to her sense of site of origin, but it also was an incredibly expensive pigment. In fact, the most expensive thing in a painting like this was the gold, actual gold leaf, and the blue pigment, actual precious lapis ground up. And so the materiality of these pigments doesn't fade. I mean, lapis is lapis is lapis. And if it's not in a resinous varnish, it won't yellow. Its surfaces are very fragile. And in fact, a lot of the large altarpieces were subjected to the well-meaning intentions of a lot of the, I guess we'll just call it as we know it, sort of the ladies of the altar guild who would sort of try to wipe off the soot of the candles and the incense on them. And of course, they weren't using cotton swabs and weren't wearing white lab coats the way conservators often do today. And it's that abrasion that slowly works against these surfaces because we don't know We have some sense that these may have been varnished to protect them, but we don't know that they were.
Thank you. We have an online question that's asking, how would you compare Duccio and the Siena tradition to Giotto in Florence?
That's a lovely question. The answer is either very complex or can maybe be distilled very easily, maybe between poetry and prose. You can see that I put Duccio in the poetry category, both equally important expressions, but very different in how they work. Giotto, truly one of the greatest mural painters of all time, a spatial painter. But I think one of the things that ever since Vasari and a more systematized history of Italian painting in the 16th century that got lost was a greater sense of exchange between important artistic centers such as Florence and neighboring Siena. That confusion we saw in Frederick Leighton in the 19th century of a work by perhaps Giotto's teacher, Cimabue, but actually a painting by Duccio, the Sienese painter. Duccio was actually given the commission for the most important altarpiece in the major Dominican church of Florence, Santa Maria Novella. It was not Giotto, it was not a Florentine painter, it was the Sienese painter Duccio. And likewise, the high altar of the Franciscan church, Santa Croce in Florence, didn't have a work by Giotto, didn't have a work by one of Giotto's pupils, but actually had a painting by Ugolino da Siena. I think the Florentines recognized that these Sienese were onto something when it came to altar painting. And I think that's proven by the fact that there isn't a single major Florentine altarpiece in Siena. Though, in answer to that question, the expansion of the Sienese style, the sort of greater diaspora of Sienese painting is truly due to not only networks of patronage, but also these extraordinary small images that traveled across borders to various regions. Large monumental frescoes can't move. You go to them. The walls are where they are. And so it's sort of wonderful to think of things in France that are of Italian origin, not just Italian, but Sienese, or in the south of Italy that were made by Sienese painters and made their way there. Sorry,
Thank you, Stephan. You made there are a lot of responses about the Sienese in relation to the modern and in relation to modernity. And in a sense, my question is the opposite of that. I'm really interested in what, in your experience of researching this work, is so far away from the modern or modernity, so that when you're doing research on it at a certain point, you feel like you're crossing a kind of threshold or you're entering a reality that's very difficult for us to understand. And I wonder if this, what I'm saying, rings a bell at all, and if there's something that jumps to your mind here in terms of its difference or otherness that really stands out for you, whether you could speak to that.
It's a great question. I guess I see less the otherness than I see the holes, the lacunae, what's missing, what we don't have. You know, however you count them, whether we have 5, 6, 7 at most works by Duccio that come down to us other than his great Maestà for the Siena Cathedral, that's a very small artistic oeuvre for an artist who worked for 20 or 30 years. Think of that. Even Vermeer left us 30-some-odd paintings, right? We're looking at very few works to build a very big story. And so you need a lot of, you need a voice of some kind to build a narrative, to build some kind of story to them. And whether it's from the archives, whether it's from I would argue, more importantly, looking, that story has to be told with very little. And in fact, the fourth object in that first space around the Met's small Duccio that I put there, I put with a lot of misgivings. It's a ruined head of Christ from a very important crucifixion. In fact, it was arguably the most admired wooden sculpture from the 14th century in Siena. As admired as it was, no one could come up with a maker or an actual date, so we just said Sienese, middle of the 14th century. And in 1944, it was at the church of the Osservanza, a mile from town. And in 1944, an Allied bomb landed right on the Osservanza and destroyed all of the great Della Robbia altarpieces, and the cross fell to the ground and pulverized from the heat, and all that's left is a head and a few other body shards. And when they were amassed and taken to conservation, out of one of the fragments came a parchment that had a series of prayers, and out of the other came a parchment that said, I, Landino di Pietro, made this in 1338. And so we got an attribution, we got a date, but we lost the work of art. And so the presence and the distance is hard to separate when you're at that moment. You have a whole world that opens. We knew of Lando di Pietro as an architect in Orvieto. We knew him as a goldsmith. We never knew him as a wooden sculptor, and yet we didn't have the wooden sculpture to look at anymore. So, you know, our present imagination, I think, obviously informed, is what guides us into understanding more fully the complexities of the material we're looking at. I don't see that huge threshold, I have to say, between my experience today in New York in 2024 and Siena in 1300. It's impossible for me to put myself back in those shoes.
I'm interested in the cataclysm of the plague and imagining a society disrupted by the loss of 2/3 of its members. With respect to art in Siena in particular, what happens in, let's say, the next 50 to 100 years? Does the art look extremely different, somewhat different? I imagine the subject matter may evolve a bit as well.
That's a great question, and one that has many parts. I'll start by bringing it home and making it very personal. I was working on this project in 2020 when we were all confronted with COVID and this pandemic, this contagion that none of us understood, that no one knew how we were going to catch, or no one knew whether it was going to be the end of us. And that was very much on my mind as I'm thinking about this late moment from day to day. You didn't know who would be around you. Obviously, we had a lot more help in navigating that than they did in the 14th century. But the question you ask is a very interesting one because it assumes certain things. It assumes one geography, and it assumes then with that geography a certain project. And what I love thinking about in terms of Siena is, sure, when you look at Siena in the 15th century, just as a site for artistic production, it's very different from Florence. In fact, you know, people sort of say, oh, those poor Sienese, they were just in that nostalgic rut. They never could get out of the great inventions of the previous century. They keep going back and making the same compositions, drawing from the same sources, and just keep doing it over and over again, whether it's in the brush of Giovanni di Paolo or Sano di Pietro, whoever these artists may be. What's so fascinating to think about in this story is these works, a work like this great painting in Liverpool, may never have found itself in Italian soil. It was in probably Avignon for its entirety. The wonderful small Orsini polyptych we saw that was in the Chartreuse de Chaumont outside of Dijon, that never got back to Italy. The two wonderful triptychs that we saw of Duccio early on, those are last recorded in a will that was executed in Avignon in 1320. They were meant to go back to a convent in Italy. Did they ever go? We don't know. This is the first time they've ever been seen together since that will was drafted. And I ask people in this exhibition to imagine a Siena outside of Siena in the 15th century. I asked them to imagine what agency Sienese painting would have for the work of Netherlandish painters, for Burgundian artists, for the Limburg brothers, and others, and not just to see it as a geographically fixed Sienese painting tradition.
We have another online question, which is asking about the brothers. This person's curious if Pietro or Ambrogio received more commissions than the other, and did they collaborate a lot on the same pieces or primarily received separate commissions?
I would love to have a simple answer for that. Were they rivals? Were they collaborators? Were they friends? What were they? What they were was just very different artists. Pietro somehow is exposed to Rome, and I don't know what that means, but the monumentality, the plasticity of his figural form is definitely informed by something very different, especially than Simone Martini, but certainly from Ambrogio Lorenzetti. And it's no surprise to me, but I have no simple answer as to why, that Pietro Lorenzetti finds himself as the person charged with finishing the abandoned fresco cycle that Giotto and his workshop were working on in the lower church of Assisi in the 1320s. Why didn't the people charged with the commission in Assisi? And Assisi is a papal basilica. It's the Basilica of Assisi. It's not a church. It reports to Rome. So how did they come upon finding Pietro Lorenzetti to finish Giotto's work left unfinished? I don't have the answer for that, but the question is a fascinating one. Where was he, and how did they know of him, and why did he, Sienese painter that he was, get into that workshop? On the other hand, one of the most fascinating things to think about is the first real record we have of Ambrogio Lorenzetti's work, and that comes down to us through the Florentine Lorenzo Ghiberti, who we all know as a practicing artist, but we also have to remember the great treatise that Ghiberti writes called The Commentaries, I Commentarii, and it's the first real exploration of Italian art in the century leading up to his writing it in the first quarter of the 15th century in Florence. And the only painter that Ghiberti mentions by name is Ambrogio Lorenzetti, not a Florentine painter. And he's fascinated by Ambrogio because he says there was Ambrogio not interested in hanging out with the manual craftsmen. He wanted to hang out with the philosophers and the thinkers and the literati, those literary types. You can imagine him with a beret. But it doesn't surprise us to think about him then when we think about his allegorical representation of good and bad government and all of these theoretical things. When we look at that extraordinary drawing of the Annunciation, I mean, that could have been done yesterday. I mean, that's just an extraordinary image. It's someone who's just so deeply diving into the subject matter of what he paints, and Ghiberti understood that. And I think so many of the first generation of Florentine painters were looking at Sienese art as their source, not Florentine. I think Fra Angelico owes almost everything to Sienese painters, and I think Ghiberti is a good example of how important Siena was for the Italian tradition.
In the Orsini polyptych, could you say something about the one panel that I think comes from Berlin with the night, or it looks almost like a sunset of some sort?
These are like all of the hardest questions ever. Where is that? Yeah, do we have it there? This night scene. It's an extraordinary thing. And if it's not made in the 14th century by Simone, when was it made and by whom was it made? So many people want to say, oh, it's a 19th century thing. One of my, a former colleague, always free with provocative thoughts, said, oh, that's basically Caspar David Friedrich and a German painter, an intervention there. And it just wasn't. It was in the Kaiser Friedrich Museum. There was no intervention recorded there. My sense is it's probably right. And it's impossible for me not to think of Simone thinking about temporality, and if that's not an Arcadian setting that totally responds to the kind of sensibilities of Virgil and the Georgics or something, I don't know what is. It totally is consonant with what I imagine Simone would do for such a scene. But there's clearly a gold ground below. And there's clearly two different campaigns of the trees. One that looks very much that it's part of that gold ground, and one that looks like it's made in that second intervention. And sadly, there's no technical analysis that answers your question. We have to just decide why that intervention would have been made and by whom and when. Was this something done in France, say, in Chambol? Was it a Burgundian artist? Or was it Simone who just thought, God, I'm going to set this in a nocturnal scene? It's really an extraordinary landscape.
Was Lorenzetti's allegory of redemption considered for this exhibition in the Pinacoteca?
Pinacoteca. You know, there's certain questions when you're curating an exhibition that you have to ask. One, what's the project? Two, what's your audience? And three, what's your ambition? And the project here was really to look at this moment through 4 different painters. And the audience was obviously an audience that wasn't that familiar with their work, unlike those that go to the Pinacoteca in Siena, who can really know these artists quite well. And the third was the ambition, which was really to try to get the very best and the best preserved works together for the first time. And that work is actually a rather compromised picture. It's very hard to read, and it's a very fascinating thing, but it's a very difficult painting to navigate. So thought it was better off staying where it is than to bringing here to New York.
Thank you very much. In the Simone Martini brought to mind the extraordinary expressiveness of the Magdalene in this. But I'm also interested in what you said about different uses of color, like the blue being expensive. And her hair is very red. And I'm interested actually in the history of red hair and as being odd. So would you, and also that in the other painting that Joseph has had a purple thing, which later becomes associated with royalty. So I wonder if there's certain kinds of colors that you would talk about in these, and their meaning at the time.
That's a great question. The hair is not only red, but it's golden. These are golden locks. And it's incredibly expressive, and sometimes in some of these artists' work, it even integrates gold lines and striations so that it even sparkles the way often our hair does when the light catches it, and it becomes sort of transparent. And the wonderful thing of looking at these paintings is also to really familiarize oneself with the very personal palette of each of these artists. Duccio is truly the poet of the half-tone. In the postmodern era of those pinks and violets and all those colors that we still often see in waiting rooms when we go to the doctors and stuff. Those sort of less than primary colors, maybe brought from Byzantium often, are things that Duccio truly responds to. And it's so wonderful to see his palette resolved in that way. I think Simone builds on that and takes it one step further and is completely beguiled by translucent enamels, where the gold and silver surfaces flicker and are never quite fixed. And I think that Ambrogio is not the technician at all and not interested in those questions of tonality, and Pietro neither. So I think it's a very important part of each artist's style and each artist's interests, but they pursue each of those questions. They pursue those questions each very differently. Starting to make no sense here.
Any final question?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is terrific.
Pleasure.